Well, welcome everyone to April 11th here. What Mike was at, if anybody has any inquiries regarding Mike and his emus, right, well, you know where to find him, that's for sure. And as you know, it's quite the menagerie that Mike keeps up there, in the little woods up there. So I think that, I think we may have to plan an intervention for Mike, as he creates a safari up there for animals and wildlife. Okay, so it heads up as we begin, and we're going to be joined here a little bit later here by Dr. Laura Kraft from WSU. I'm very interested in her talk here. But I wanted to kick off by noting that as Alina shared with us, right, HortSense has got a new look and feel to it, and if you've had a chance to check it out, do so. And of course, this is a great space just to be referencing folks to. And the changes and improvements they've made in usability, I think, are going to make it that much more appealing for folks, for our clients who might be inquiring and might be asking for things might be curious as to self-serve themselves for info. Okay, so for today, we'll go through our April to-dos. I'm eager for be thinking now about announcements and question and comments and sharing that you all might want to do for the group. We've got a lot coming up over the next month with the Home and Garden Show, so we'll definitely be looking to Terry, Rhonda, and Robin for their announcements, and then for anybody else's announcements with respect to things going on. Lots of things happening in April. In particular, I want to do a shout out to eNews. This month's eNews has a ton of information regarding continuing education opportunities and news. So do check it out. It came last Friday. If you did not receive it, please reach out to John or Katie. We have a board meeting tonight at 6 p.m. So our board meets tonight at 6 p.m. Everyone's welcome to join in that meeting there. Midge, we're here to celebrate your birthday tomorrow, so congratulations. Anne, Karen, Brenda has a birthday this week as well. In fact, notice all the birthdays are in the same week here, right? So it's quite the celebratory week, we can be having here. I wanted to make a note that Helen's got the Lake Sylvia walks both this Sunday and next Saturday, and the Saturday next coming up, and study group is next Monday, the 17th. So again, details on all of this are in the eNews. But happy birthday to all of the April days. Also, a shout out to Chris and the updates on our website, pnwmg.org. The scholarship for 2023 is open. And so this is an opportunity, right, for a graduating senior in any of our two counties, right, to pitch for $1,000 scholarship that we're prepared to award. So anybody here from the scholarship committee want to make any comments or have any pitch that they'd like to make for the group at large? Okay. And also, of course, also noted that we've got a workshop this Sunday, April 16th, right, on planning for vegetables, and shout out there for at the Elma Garden. So again, check out pnwmg.org. So we gather here today as a foundation. Recall that we are here as a separate 501c3 nonprofit corporation recognized in the state. And what we do, here as a foundation is raise funds to support our programs. We are, by the way, I think the only county program that independently has to support our program coordinators. So we actually have a purpose in the fundraising, in that we actually need to fundraise to sustain ourselves. We obviously also educate and inform, and with Mike adding emus to our intelligentsia, we're able to actually provide quite a bit of poultry information, right, of all sizes and information here. So Mike, you'll definitely have to let us know when you have ostriches, so that we actually can complete the entire spectrum of poultry support here. Okay. And of course, we come together as a group here, as a community, not just to socialize, but to learn. And so we highly value the opportunities we have to come together and to learn. And that today will be a great example of that as Laura Kraft presentation kicks into. Also want to do a shout out is that, the state is making some transitions with respect to their public websites. We already have a presence in the state umbrella. We'll be enhancing that presence as we go through the year, but they do a really good job on this website here at mastergardener.wsu.edu of explaining what the program is and what the foundation is, right? So we all are master gardeners and we adhere to the precepts of the Master Gardener program as specified by WSU Extension. But we also come together today as a foundation to do those three activities and three focuses that I mentioned on the last slide. So there's a difference between the program activities and the foundation activities, and that's of course that if you want more information on that, of course you can go back to last month's presentation with Tana Hassert and Jennifer Marquis, and that recording is on our YouTube channel, and you'll have a whole discussion regarding that. Our elected board, our board for the foundation for 2023 is led by Sabine. She can't be here this morning. She had to run a neighbor to a community service. And by the way, it's a great example of the fact that as master gardeners, we often find ourselves, being called to service in the community. And that's exactly what Sabine is doing today. So when she joins us tonight for our board meeting, let's make sure we congratulate her on the extra effort that she's having to take out of her time today to support her community. So I'm here as your vice president, Lori is your secretary, Renee and Sharon, an admirable super job as our treasurers. Karen, Aaron and Sharon, I needed to update that, Aaron, my apologies for not updating you as a new state rep here. Margie and Lauren for program support, and Terry, Robin, and Rhonda, otherwise known as Team Terry, on their public events. For our county representations, right, this is Jan is leading our Pacific County activities. Valerie leads our Greater Grays Harbor organization, and Sushila leads the North Beach operation. And of course, Tony is our faculty liaison, and Alina and Brenda present here as not only as master gardeners, but also as our program coordinators. Okay, so remember that for 2023, we've changed the schedule here so that the first 2 months of each quarter, our meetings for the foundation will be at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays. On the third month of the quarter, the meetings will be held at 10 a.m. on Saturdays. The URL for today's meeting and for all the meetings is the same, right? So, tinyurl.com, pnwmg-zoom. So again, that our meetings this month and next month will be on Tuesdays, and come June will be on Saturdays. Okay. Our board meetings will always be here on Tuesdays evenings. Okay, and so that'll be the opportunity here for everyone to join again tonight, and the URL is again the same for all of the meetings, tinyurl.com board-pnwmg. Okay, so hope to see as many of you as possible this evening at 6 p.m. Okay, so we're into April, and so it's interesting that OSU is highly optimistic about soil temperatures and the ability to start planting. Notice that they're talking about when the soil is consistently above 60 is when we're ready to put the seeds in. I assured you, I just checked WSU's weather data set this morning, and we're not quite there. In fact, we're a long ways from there, as you can see from the temperature readings across our two county areas here. So, by the way, I found it very interesting. By the way, if you look at Montesano, that your 8-inch temperature is actually less than the 2-inch temperature. And I would have thought your 8-inch temperature would have been higher, which is your kind of traditionally. But we always knew the folks up in Montesano and East Grays Harbor County were a little upside down. So perhaps that's the explanation we're seeing here. So again, a shout out, if you don't have a soil thermometer, a shout out to WSU's WeatherNet website here, because tremendous amount of information. And it's fascinating just to check and see these official readings here. So bookmark this website and deference be comfortable referencing it for this kind of information, and of course referring clients to the website as well. Okay. Also in April, they talk about, getting back and starting to get ready, with our, finalizing pruning and getting the right composting and manure all set, within our landscapes. Interesting that they're talking here about late spring frost. And this is another opportunity, of course, of looking at where frost might occur across our areas, including some of the areas over where Aaron's at in the far east part of the county. It's possible to have a frost even at the end of May. So, and even here right on the coast, right, it's not uncommon that we might experience a frost as late as early May. So, depending upon where you live, we still have a month perhaps of frost risk for our plantings. So this is and of course this is coming at a time when all of our nurseries are pushing plants and pushing their population to get plants out and into their gardens. And of course, as we all know, it's way too wet. And as you can see here from the temperatures, it's way too early to be thinking about that. So again, another caution in terms of talking to our folks about this. Pest monitoring, interesting, a great comment here about managing weeds while they're still small and actively growing, because it's a lot easier to take care of them now once they're once they're still small and when able to work off. A shout out also for this publication from the Pacific Northwest Coalition of Research Institutions. That's managing diseases and insects in home orchards. This is a great time to be thinking about preparation of fruit trees in advance of budding and pushing out. Okay. And of course, under planning, again, that cold weather activities that are being recommended here. OSU is saying, go ahead and think about, planting a lot of the root vegetables you can see, and inland valleys. Remember, we're talking the entire state of Oregon, so there's a tremendous variability in terms of temperatures and opportunities for growing things there. I think we'd be better set to hold off until we get some decent temperatures here, and certainly until we get our precipitation more in line with a soil that's not going to be compacted and compressed. But indeed, it's time to start thinking about planting. I know that Bev, who's on the call here this morning, put seeds out into the greenhouse yesterday. So at least we're getting a start. Okay, other big announcements and comments from everyone. I definitely, Terry, I'll have comments. I'll reach out to you on a couple slides here. But other announcements of programs. Midge, you want to do a pitch for study group next Monday?
I sure can. Next Monday, we are talking about soil health. And I just want to make a note that WSU really does not have a lot of information on soil health, but OSU does. It's kind of surprising to some of us because that's one of the program priorities for WSU, but there you go. So anyway, we are going to be talking about soil health, and Jude is going to address new construction, and Val is going to talk about the 4 soil health principles from OSU. So be studying up on what you want to talk about soil health, whether you want to encourage people to do no-till gardening or composting or whatever. So anyway, that's our topic for next.
And of course,
Monday.
We can remember James Cassidy from OSU. His favorite response, right? Yeah. Is it, what's the answer to every question I'm going to ask, right?
Yeah.
Add organic matter, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I know, I wish I had a copy of his recording. I may have to look that up.
We do have it, and so I can
You
definitely
do?
post it up. But
Okay.
yeah, we do have it.
Okay. Yeah, he was
Rhonda,
very
you have your
entertaining.
hand up, and you're on mute. No, apparently you're not on mute, but we're not hearing you. Why don't you sort that out? I'll go to Alina, who has her hand up.
Yes, Brenda and I just wanted to celebrate the fact that Kelly and Terry Small and Sharon Coolish Bales were honored as outstanding master gardeners this past Saturday as part of the 50th anniversary celebration event in Puyallup. So big shout out to you three. Thank you, representing Grays Harbor and Pacific County.
We're very flattered, for sure. And of course, we wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't fun. So that's the end of the day. It's just I think we're doing what we love. But thanks for the recognition, Alina. Jude, you have your hand up. Oh, you're on mute.
You couldn't read my lips. I was saying wonderful things. Our plant clinic refresher class is returned after 4 years absent. It'll be on the last Saturday of this month. There's still time to sign up. We have some really good things lined up for you, some new things this year. So don't expect the same old, same old. I hope that you will be able to come, and so that you'll be all fit for doing clinics this summer.
And details in the e-news, right?
Exactly.
Very good. Thanks, Jude. Rhonda, are you back online here?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
It did an update as I logged in and I wondered. Just a quick notice in the email, in the e-news, I was looking for somebody to take on a project with some donated ceramic planters for the garden tour and the plant sale. And I'm happy to announce that Sushila contacted me and her group is taking them. I'll get them to them Saturday and they'll be growing something wonderful for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Sushila, you have your hand up.
Hi. Yeah, we're happy to do that, Rhonda. If everybody looked in their e-news, we are still looking for a chairperson, and this can be anybody in the Master Gardener membership or, our membership, to take over from Bridget, who really wants to retire from this position, our plant clinic chair. So anybody can come and take that over. We already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plant clinics planned for the rest of this year, starting in May. And also a chairperson to head up the demo beds. We do have a plan to plant the 4 WSU demonstration gardens, but we would like a person to head that up as far as the reporting and leadership of that. We did have a great, just so everybody knows, the conference was a big hit with Rhonda and Renee and all of the garden board members showing up for the 2023 nonprofit conference. It was well done, fabulous. Haikus were submitted and Bridget won the haiku. So it was a fabulous haiku. And I think Katie printed it in the e-news as well. And then we are still doing, we do need volunteers for the Mother's Day flower planter sale that we're having here in North Beach the weekend before the Home and Garden Show. So we're doing it for one day on the 13th. So anybody that wants to come out and help us sell those, they usually go within the first half hour. I'm just kidding, but they do go really fast and we usually never have any left. And that'll be on the 13th of May from 10 to 3, I think. So if anybody wants to help out in that, you get credit hours and just text me or give me an email. And that's it. So.
Thanks, Sushila.
Mm-hmm.
Tony, you have your hand up.
I do. I'm being very polite.
And I
You-
have,
you say that with an expectation that we're supposed to be surprised, right? That's for sure.
yes,
Yeah.
because I have to put my WSU hat on because I don't make these things up. WSU requires an awful lot of us, especially recently. And one of the things that I'm struggling with is your guys's schedules. I follow your schedule online and I follow your schedule when I get the newsletter, because like I know you guys had a newsletter on Monday, but I haven't seen it yet. But I take those dates and I take those dates as gospel. And I am hearing and seeing as because I've been popping into some meetings, that there are some meetings that are Master Gardener meetings that are not on an official schedule, and your official schedule is either the newsletter or online. So what happens if you don't have your Master Gardener meeting thing on one of those? Then to me, it's not real. So if you like cut your arm off at one of those meetings and then called me and said, yeah, we have to do your insurance claim, the first thing that the university and I are going to say is, prove to me that it was truly a Master Gardener event. And you would prove to me that it's a Master Gardener event because it will be listed either in your newsletter or on your online calendar. The second thing will be, after you stop bleeding, of course, did you put your hours in Give Pulse? And then you're good to go. So please, guys, if you want to see me pop around, get your meetings in. And if you want to be official, please put your meetings where they need to be. That's what I've got.
Thanks, Tony. I know you sound a little pedantic, but I appreciate the fact that it's really is important, right? Because if we're especially on the insurance coverage, right, is that we have to definitely make sure that we're on the up and up with that. And so those two key points are key, right? Is making sure that the meeting is published and it's clearly identified as a formal meeting, either in e-news or on the website, right? And that that we're all recording our hours prudently onto a Give Pulse.
Right. And then that way I can hold you guys up as the shining examples to 4-H. And Kelly, I'm starting a list of words Kelly uses to describe Tony. And I've added snarky and pandemic now.
No, that's pedantic.
Pedantic. Thank
yes,
you. Sorry.
Thanks, Tony. Other announcements from folks? Okay. I want to keep going on and just in that same thread here is that make sure, right, that when you're submitting to the e-news or to the website, right, or to Katie for email blast, that you're giving plenty of lead time. And at mea culpa, I was actually late in my own submission to the e-news this past week. So it is something to be really thoughtful of, because a lot of work goes on from Chris and John and Katie in terms of preparing our formal communications. And so let's help them out by thinking ahead and making sure that we're doing our part in terms of getting notices published early on. Okay. We are, we're coming up to, just a little over a month ahead. We will have one more meeting, right? We will have one more foundation meeting on a Tuesday ahead of Mother's Day, and it will be ahead of the Home and Garden Show. But we are hurtling towards May 20th and 21st. So Terry, kick it off. Talk to us.
Okay. Well, I'm extremely excited about this Home and Garden Show. It feels like we're back to almost where we were before the pandemic. The venue is going to be full. We have, thanks to Midge, some really exciting speakers lined up for the meeting room, including Cisco. And on Saturday, we have a poultry expert. Pamela Watson from Lewis County is going to be doing a presentation on raising poultry, which I think will be really, really interesting. Plus, we have presentations on pruning, on fruit trees, vegetable gardening, all kinds of relevant topics for gardeners this time of year. Also, there's been a great response for people signing up to volunteer. A couple of places would be great to hear from people. One is door greeting, which is really important. That's how we get geographic information that qualifies us to get our $5,000 for the tourism grant. We go through and look at all the entry cards that people fill out to find out where they're coming from. So if you like that kind of a volunteer activity, let me know. We have 3 people that do like it that are going to be the anchors for that, but we need lots of people to do short shifts as well. The other thing is, of course, and Lori could speak to this, is cookies. We need lots and lots of cookies and other baked goods because we actually make quite a bit of money on that. So that's what I have to say. Rhonda and Robin, do you want to add anything else?
I'll speak up just for a moment. Robin is home healing. She is a little under the weather, so she's watching, but listening. The venue on the home side is full. We're pretty excited about it. The venue on the garden side, we unfortunately had a vendor just pull out. That's a longtime vendor. So we are looking for some interesting gardening items to go on that side. And if you have a recommendation, please email Robin directly or myself if you've got mine. And we're looking forward to being organized, having lots of volunteers, new things to see there, and new ways to participate. And it's going to be an all-around great show.
We can't,
That's it.
we really can't understate, we can't overstate how important this show is, by the way, as an economic development engine for Grays Harbor County. So this is what the work that we do here is not only furthers our mission as master gardeners, but as Rhonda is pointing out, right, it's just, there are dozens of vendors, right, for whom this is a major program activity for them. So it's a significant effort in terms of community service, what we do here.
And following that up, Kelly, the vast majority of the vendors are local to Grays Harbor County.
Yep.
I have a quick question related to the website. Do you want me to take down the vendor information or just leave it there? To contact you to be a vendor, since you said the home side was full.
I'm going to ask you to leave it. What we're
Okay.
both doing is we're compiling a wait list because it is not unusual 2 to 3 weeks before the event to have somebody pull out. So we both have wait lists that we're hopeful to be not using, but we like to have the contacts. So keep it up for us.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris, for asking.
One other kind of interesting bit of information is this is our 21st Home and Garden Show. It started out as the Lawn and Garden Show and 21 years ago. And this is going to be our 25th garden tour. So those are, I think, are very significant milestones for our organization that we've done this year after year.
Kudos to ourselves. Any other questions or comments for Terry, Rhonda, or Robin regarding the Home and Garden Show? If you haven't, submitted, a volunteer sheet, right, in terms of where you want to make your play for that week, do so and be thinking about as much time as you can, because it's an all hands on deck, calling for us.
Kelly, I do have a question about the garden tour.
Please.
Where is it going to be this year?
Good question. It's going to be July 22nd, and it's in Elma and McCleary. So we will be able to include the demo garden as an official garden tour this year, which is really appropriate with all these anniversaries happening this year. And the Elma Demo Garden group is working really hard to have some extra special things happen at the demo garden in anticipation of July 22nd.
Mike will probably be able to parade an emu around the garden. Won't that
That
be
would be great.
That's also a great tip off, though, is that remember for the plant sale on that July 22nd, now is the time to be thinking about, putting together your new starts or divisions or other kind of propagations for that. It's just 3 months away, right? When you start thinking about July. So it's time to start thinking about making that all happen. Okay. Okay, and a quick shout out, by the way, that the state conference will be the end of September this year. It'll be in Tacoma, a great opportunity for continuing education hours. Volunteers are, of course, always needed to help support the program there. So again, another opportunity for program support hours, right, by participating at the state level. Aaron, Karen, Sharon, any comments you want to make regarding the state foundation, state conference? Okay. And then a final comment to underscore what Tony was saying earlier. It's so important that we get our hours recorded. And again, it's so easy not to take the time to get the hours recorded, but it is so very important that we do jump onto that and make that happen. So a shout out. And Brenda, Alina, any comments? How are we doing overall? Giving us at least a grade, hopefully a B+ or greater, in terms of getting hours in overall?
I can just say that I'm verifying the hours once a week now, and I'm probably having from 100 or more posts every week. So I would say that we're really on top of it. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's keep it up. Okay.
Kelly, I have a question about hours.
Please.
And I'm on my phone, which I don't normally do because my computer is just acting up. Anyway, when I try to enter my hours using the app on my phone, I can't find where you put in the actual hour, like I was there from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. Is anybody else having that problem?
Okay. I can answer that. I don't know if Brenda's on the phone today, on the meeting today. She can be more specific than me, but it's my understanding that it's hard to enter hours on an iPhone. But you can talk to Brenda Priestley after the meeting and she will give you more help because she is still attending the weekly Give Pulse meetings.
Okay, so what they just reminded everyone, and they say it a lot because we have new people come into the meeting every week. Do not use the phone app to enter your hours. It does not, like Garnet just said, it does not open up a window to put your start and end times, and it never will. So if you're going to use your smartphone to enter hours, you need to open it in a browser, not in the app. The app does not work correctly.
Okay, that's really important information because I'm one of those ones that gets behind 6 weeks or so because I hardly ever open my computer, and I do things on my smartphone. And so if I can learn to do it as the meeting or whatever I'm at ends, if I just sit right there and do it. I remember Katie did that as we were going through our training. And so I've been trying to do that, but then I get in this rabbit hole. So thank you very much. Solves the problem for me.
Okay.
And again, just a quick reminder, if you do have any questions regarding Give Pulse, both Alina and Brenda are right there, and so reach out to them and you'll have a help desk that is far more responsive than any other help desk for any other app you're going to have, on your computer.
Yeah,
Again,
and you know what? Give Pulse is Give Pulse. What can I say? I'm not going to make excuses for it. So please don't sit there going down a rabbit hole every time you want to enter information. Just cut to the chase and ask Brenda or me, okay? We don't want you spending hours trying to figure it out when one of us can help you do it, okay?
So any other announcements, comments from folks?
Kelly, I came up with something for the from the State Foundation, and it's a little bit late notice, but tomorrow is the Cougs Give campaign, and their focus, the Connors Dean's focus, is the endowed chair for Master Gardeners, and that's what Connors is promoting the most for the campaign. You'll see a lot on social media tomorrow asking for donations. We have reach goals. The first 50 donations unlocks like a $2,500 matching donation. And I think it's just cougsgives.wsu.edu is the website.
If you can find that and put that in chat, Aaron, that'd be great.
Sure.
Yeah. And again, this is what Aaron's of course referring to is at WSU Extension. We actually seek to actually have an endowed chair representing Master Gardeners, into the Connors University area here. So it is kind of a big deal, but it's going to require massive support from all of us to make that happen. Any other announcements?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Rick.
Yeah, Katie and I were on 94.7 yesterday, Johnny Manson, and we talked about all of these things that you have covered today, plus the Home and Garden Show, plus our workshop this Sunday, and everything else, the scholarship. We talked for a solid hour there about everything you've talked about, including soil temperatures. And we're going to be back on the air again on the 15th of May before the Home and Garden Show. And I just wanted to let everybody know if they wanted to call in and ask us questions, that would be very much appreciated.
Rick, you guys ought to start a podcast, really, right? I mean, this is it's such good information you have. We really ought to serialize this and get this out there.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about it with Katie, but Katie's so busy already. I don't know if she has time to do that, but we'll give it a thought.
Anyway, this is it again. It's a great public outreach because again, using that medium of the radio, reaching an entire other audience, entire other demographic that we very much want to serve and want to reach out to.
Yeah, and last week we were on KXRO with Kyle Pauly, and of course we'll be on again before the Home and Garden Show. And so we'll get a little publicity there too.
Thanks much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, a shout out now for next month. So next month on Tuesday, May 9th, Kylie Smith from our small farms coordinator at WSU Alma will be joining us, and she's going to be talking. One of the great things she's going to be talking about is the Marsh Master. And that's the picture you're looking at here. It's basically a tank, right? It's a tank that goes out in the tidelands, and we're talking when we talk about weed control, out here in Grays Harbor and Pacific counties, we're talking serious stomping of the weeds here. So there's going to be a lot of information that she'll be offering, as we get out to there. Midge, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Kylie will also be giving a talk at the Home and Garden Show on Saturday.
Yep.
So, and it'll be about her noxious weed program.
There you go. So it's not that Kylie's noxious, but what she focuses on. Yes.
No, she's not noxious.
Yeah.
She's very entertaining.
Okay, and so a reminder, of course, is that part of what we are talking about, in terms of all these emphases this is the first year, right, that WSU Extension has given these kind of 8 emphases for our Master Gardener program, and it's this is the first year they're talking about climate change as a key emphasis. We're talking about clean water and water conservation as key emphases, soil health, as we noted earlier. Pollinators, local food, plant diversity, nearby nature, as we've been talking about, wildfire preparedness, including wildfire preparedness on the west side. If you notice that it's the first year that DNR is actually funding programs for wildfire prevention here on the west side of the state. So this is a market change in terms of our own thinking about where fires can occur, not just in the Cascades, not just on the east side. Okay. But with that, I want to do a quick introduction to the newest member of WSU Extension's team, and our new member here in Pacific County, Dr. Laura Kraft. And she joined us all the way from Florida, right? So she couldn't have found it, it's talk about a change in climate and a change in in destination, right? Coming from Florida to here. And of course, but I'm very excited, Laura, that you're joining us here this morning, and very excited that you'll be talking about the programs you're undertaking, because going back to the service, going back to the economic engines of our two counties from an agricultural standpoint, you, Laura, are right in the middle of some of the most critical industries, ag food industries here, that support our two counties. And so it's an incredibly significant role that you're serving here on this. But I'm going to go ahead and stop share and allow you to share, introduce yourself and your background, and take it on.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction. Let me go ahead and share. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yep, we got it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so like you'd mentioned, I have bounced around a little bit. And so my goal today was kind of to just come up with like something fun to talk with you guys about. So I'm going to go through some of my past research and especially kind of touch on those topics that I think are most interesting or most relevant to home gardeners. And then, of course, I will talk about also the programs that I'm hoping to start here in Long Beach. So for those of you who don't know, I think most of you guys are in the county. So this is where our extension office is, all the way down in Long Beach. And like I'd mentioned, I'm just going to go through some of my past research today, kind of what even got me to this role, and also kind of mention some fun jobs that I've had in the past. So I got my joint bachelor's master's from the University of Georgia. And while I was there, I studied aphid symbionts and resistance traits that mediate competition between rival parasitoids, which always feels like such a mouthful of a title. That was the title of the publication we wound up publishing. But it's really interesting because aphids, are often found in gardens. And so this was really some of the research that anytime I speak to with master gardeners, they're most excited about kind of what this research looked like. So just to kind of give you some perspective, I'll go through the history of the pea aphid. So this is the pea aphid, if you're not familiar with it. It's just a really generalist pest. It's found more often on forage crops and things like that. So this isn't necessarily the aphid you're most likely to find if you're looking at roses or some of those other crops that get aphids frequently. And the pea aphid is actually not native to North America. So it was first introduced here in the late 1800s. Like I mentioned, it's a pest on forest crops. And what's really interesting about it is that, even we knew in the early 1900s that it was being attacked by a native generalist parasitoid called Pran pequidorum, or for the rest of this talk, I'm going to refer to this as the native parasitoid. Unfortunately, neither of these have any common names, so we'll call them the native parasitoid for now. So it's pretty good news. Essentially, we have this pest that comes in, but there is some native stuff that's able to kind of to bring down its population. But it wasn't sufficient. And so in the 1950s, there was like this big movement in entomology. They were really interested in going in and trying to find parasitoids or predators from the original range and bring them to, the area that the pest was infesting in order to kind of manage the population. It was really like a fad back in the 1950s. And so they went back to the native range, which is Eurasia, and they found these two wasps called Aphidius urvi and Aphidius smithii. And they introduced them repeatedly in the 1950s to help kind of decrease that aphid. And so what wound up happening is that Aphidius urvi, which we're now going to call the introduced wasp, was actually really highly successful. And so by 1983, Aphidius urvi had completely outcompeted Aphidius smithii. We still find a little bit of smithii, but not a ton in the population in North America. So thankfully, that introduced parasitoid was successful at parasitizing pea aphids. So what's really cool about this is that some people were doing these historical looks at parasitism of the pea aphid at the time. So they would literally just go out into large forage fields up in the northern parts of the United States and Canada. And they were essentially just asking, what is parasitizing these aphids? And so what they found was that, you can see that the first data was taken in 1925. And so they found that about a little more than 40% of parasitism was by native wasps and kind of some other wasps, or excuse me, the blue is that specific native wasp that we're talking about. So that Aphidius urvi wasp, and then the gray is just other wasps. So there, was some low level of parasitism that was happening prior to the introduction of Aphidius urvi in the 1950s. You can see it there with that little red arrow. So in the beginning, we actually didn't see any Aphidius urvi or that introduced wasp. It hadn't quite kind of built up its population yet. And that all changed in the 1980s. All of a sudden, and this is pretty typical of even invasive species, we see that they start at really low levels and then they're able to really kind of find their niche in the local ecology and really be able to take off. So you can really see in 1983, there's that introduced wasp in green, and it's really taken over all parasitism. So what's incredible is that it's displaced all native parasitoids in the aphid, except for that very specific native wasp, the Pranpequidorum. And so we're really interested in trying to understand like what factors are actually contributing to that native wasp of Pranpequidorum persisting. And so specifically kind of thinking about how these parasitoids work, they are both solitary endoparasitoids. And so what that means is that when that wasp is laying an egg instead of that aphid, only one wasp is going to survive. So even if that female wasp happens to lay 2 eggs, one will eat the other one. And so only one wasp can survive. The aphid is just not big enough to harbor a lot of wasps the way that like your tobacco hornworm might. There's that kind of classic image of like the tobacco hornworm with all of the parasitoids on it. This is not that case. So there is some research that shows that based on these 2 wasps separately in the lab. And so essentially the introduced wasp, that one that was brought in, is considered to be a superior external competitor based on that study that we just saw looking at, historical levels. It's really been able to take over all of those other native wasps. And it's shown that when aphid densities are really high, it does a really great job of foraging. And so specifically, this is like a really distinct behavioral change. And you can really tell when the wasp is doing its foraging behavior. They become very tense. They kind of move their bodies a little bit lower onto their legs. And you can see that their antennae are just moving the whole time. And so they have this fantastic zigzag pattern. And essentially, once they have smelled an aphid host, they're like really honed into finding more and more and more aphid hosts. But one of the challenges with that is that they do get very distracted by other host species. So they found in these kind of really interesting behavioral studies that like they're honed in, they're zigzagging looking for aphids, but as soon as another wasp comes in, they tend to immediately stop foraging. So they get distracted very easily by other species. Whereas that native wasp that we talked about before, it's considered to be a superior internal competitor. So when you have, one aphid and you let one wasp parasitize, and then that native wasp tends to win. Now, what's key here is that they've never actually looked at these 2 specific wasp species together. They've tested the native wasp against other native species, against some other introduced species, that Aphidius smithii that you remember we talked about earlier, but never against this Aphidius urvi. So that's what I propose to kind of look at. But before we get into that, there's 2 other really complicating factors. And this is the part I think is so interesting for home gardeners to think about, because all of this is happening in the aphids that you have in your garden as well. And so it turns out that in addition to having this interesting parasitoid interaction, aphids themselves have resistance traits. So typically aphids are just really susceptible to parasitism, but some of them, this is a study. You can see the % successful parasitism on the y-axis. And so essentially, all of these lines, all these bars on the x-axis are just different aphid clones. So aphids reproduce asexually, so we know that the mother is identical to the offspring. And so essentially these are different aphid lines, and you can see that in some lines, parasitoids are able to parasitize with no problem whatsoever, but in other lines, the aphid is able to survive. So, this was really perplexing people in you can see it's from 1995. People were really interested in understanding like what exactly is going on in some of these aphid lines that makes them less susceptible to that parasitism. And over time, they found that there's multiple things that are doing that. So there's this symbiont, it's called Hamiltonella defensa. And so it's literally a bacteria that has learned to play really nicely with the aphid. And so it actually lives inside the aphid. The aphid gives it specialized cells for that bacteria to live inside of, because that's how important it is to this aphid, to its survivorship, right? And so you can see that those blue bars there represent kind of the symbiont-based resistance. So you can see that successful parasitism drops off if you do have some of that that resistant symbiont. But then there's also this interesting case where there's no symbionts present, but we do still see that the aphid itself has potentially some kind of resistant genotype. So just genetically, the aphid is resistant. And then down here, it says the H. defensa plus APSE3. I know this is getting a little deep, but inside of that bacterial symbiont, there's actually a virus. So we've got numbers of layers of things going on here, but essentially that provides even extra protection. So like bacteria plus virus means you're really, really safe from parasitism. That aphid is likely to survive. So we're interested in looking at two things. How do these resistant traits within the aphid kind of change the competition internally? And that would be like if both different wasp types were each laying an egg inside of the aphid. But then also, how would that look for external competition? So in more of like a population cage study. And what we found was really interesting. So first, we had each wasp lay an egg inside of the aphid, one after the other. And so we made sure that all of the parasitism was done within 6 hours. It's been shown previously that 6 hours is kind of the key amount of time. After that time, that egg can hatch, and then they'll start eating each other. So essentially, they were more or less parasitized at the same time by the introduced wasp and by that native wasp. And so what you can see is that we saw no difference. So whether that aphid background was completely susceptible, whether it was symbiont mediated, or whether it had that kind of genetic based resistance, you can see those orange bars of survivorship are really high. So essentially the percent of mummies that wound up being that native wasp was significantly higher than the ones that wound up being that non-native wasp or that introduced wasp. So essentially, we're not seeing any change based on resistance types in internal parasitism. The native wasp is just a way better internally. But that all changed when we took this into a population cage. And so what we did is we started having like multiple generations that we were showing of these aphids and these wasps in cages. So we started each cage off with 50% of the native wasp, 50% of the introduced wasp, and a different background. So either it was completely susceptible, and that's up at the top there. I know that bar is blocking it a little bit, but these were aphids that were completely susceptible. And then we had the ones that had that symbiont or that bacterial-based resistance, and then also the ones that had that endogenous or that genetic-based resistance. So what was interesting is we saw really different results. So at first, if the aphids are just completely susceptible over 4 generations, you see that that Aphidius urvi or that introduced wasp was able to outcompete. And that's exactly what we saw in the wild, right? You remember those historical studies in the 1980s, all of a sudden that introduced wasp is just taking over all parasitism. But if there is some level of symbiont-based resistance, so that bacterial-based, or if there's that genetic-based resistance, the opposite occurs, which is really, really interesting. So in these specific cases, we do see that the native wasp is able to outcompete in 4 generations that introduced wasp. So the idea being that, going back to that original slide where we saw that there was, a ton of that introduced wasp, but just a little bit of that Prion pequidorum left over, it's possible and maybe even likely that it is this aphid-based resistance that's creating a little pocket that those native wasps are able to use to kind of continue to parasitize and continue to live off of these aphid hosts. So just really fascinating. What's cool about this is that all of this was done in the aphid, the P aphid, which is considered a model system. But of course, you have other aphids in your gardens and things like that. And they have been showing since this research that a lot of these same interactions, having these symbionts, having these native and introduced parasitoids, even seeing some genetic-based resistance, these things seem to happen in a lot of aphid species. So we are seeing these really interesting interactions, even in your garden, which is just something fun to think about when you're out gardening. So next I want to touch on my PhD research. And so in this research, I was looking at Drosophila suzukii, or the spotted wing Drosophila. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with this in your gardens. You definitely have this pest here in Washington. You've had it since about 2008, at least in Oregon in 2008, and it came up here pretty quickly. But this is an invasive pest from Asia. And it's a major pest on small fruit crops. So think about things like blueberries, but especially it's really bad on raspberries and blackberries. So your pest populations don't get quite as bad up here, but in North Carolina, they used to have a really strong raspberry market. So like that, you know, they were able to grow raspberries, and there was a really strong kind of farmers market sale that they were able to make with those raspberries. They weren't really shipping them the way that California does, but they would do fresh to market type marketing for those raspberries. And when this pest came in like the 2012, 2013, they literally lost all raspberry market because this stinking bug, this spotted winged Drosophila, has this really specialized ovipositor, or this egg-laying tube. And this is what makes it different from other Drosophila that you probably find like buzzing around your bananas, like the Drosophila that are kind of annoying around your trash can. This one's different. And it's different because this egg-laying tube is literally serrated. If you can see that, it looks like a knife. And it's also, it's sclerated, which is just a fancy word for saying it's got extra strong polymers in it that make it really sharp and pointy. And so essentially it's strong enough that it's able to puncture ripening fruit skin and lay its eggs inside. Whereas other Drosophila only attack fruit once it's kind of like starting to get really soft or really rotting. So this is able to actually infest fruit on the bush before you can put it in your mouth, which is frustrating. So unfortunately, this has been really serious for fruit crops. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, also in the southeastern US, this is definitely the #1 pest for fruit crops at this time and continues to be a real issue. And current management tactics are sometimes insufficient. So, you know, one of the challenges is with this pest is that most of what you would think of as like the economically damaging part of it is actually inside of the fruit. So here's a picture here of a blackberry, and you can see these are little eggs poking out with those two little air tubes. So the idea is that once the egg is laid inside, the larvae is able to develop within the fruit, and it's gross, right? You don't want to bite into a blackberry and see a bunch of maggots inside. So there's a zero tolerance policy. And so what that means is, when growers show up with a shipment of berries, they chill it down. And usually when they chill it down, any maggots that are inside will crawl out to the edges of the, you know, like the little clamshell. And so if somebody from quality control goes through the packaging and they find a little maggot, just one little maggot in that whole shipment, they say, nope, we see that there is some level of infestation and we're sending the entire thing back. And so it's really expensive for growers because they have to pay not only to ship the fruit to the quality control, but also to turn around and pay for that fruit to come back. And they're losing, you know, days at a time and freshness. And so there's typically other markets that they're able to sell to. They still use it for products like juice, you know, dried fruit, sometimes things like that. But unfortunately, it is a real cost to growers and continues to be a real cost to growers. So we were really interested in trying to understand one of these last big questions that we have about this pest. A lot of people have studied it, is kind of like, where are they moving? Because we have an idea that they might be coming from like a wooded edge. You think about like, if you think about like a U-pick farm, right? Like you've got all your nice blueberries, but typically whether it's on the farm or on a neighbor's farm, there's typically some kind of wooded edge. And so we're trying to understand, are flies moving to and from, or are they just staying in the berries, you know, within the fruit crop during the full day or the full season? So we decided to get really fancy about how we looked at this. It's really hard to do mark recapture, you know, so kind of like we literally tried to dust the flies with neon powder. They looked like little Cheetos. It did not work. And so what we wanted to do instead was to look at what they were feeding on in order to kind of understand how they were moving. And so we were doing that by using, it's called molecular gut content. And the idea is that you look at the DNA of the thing that the fly just fed on in order to understand more about its biology. And so part of this is kind of also understanding, how are these spotted winged Drosophila using berries as a food source? And can we use that to help understand their movement? So this was a lot of complicated work, but the long and the short of it was that I found a DNA primer, so just a little piece of DNA that was able to detect blueberry DNA within the fly gut. And so just like essentially it was very specific to blueberry, it was able to cover different varieties of blueberry. So whether it was a rabbit eye, whether it was a southern high bush or a northern high bush, which is the variety you guys, or the type of blueberries you have most often up here, it was able to cover all of those blueberries, but it would not pick up strawberries, cherries, peaches, things like that. So it was really specific to blueberry. And so using that primer, we were able to detect feeding after a single feeding event where we fed those flies blueberry for up to 7 days. Our blackberry DNA primer was a little bit different. Again, that was specific just to blackberry. And this one was really hard to get our hands on because blackberry and raspberry is so closely related, but it was only specific to blackberry, would not show raspberry. And that was only, we're only able to detect that for 2 to 4 days after a feeding event. And so what we found is we went out to the field. And so this is an example of one of my field sites here where we did our blueberry research. It's in the Sandhills part of North Carolina. And so we set up traps. Those letters A, B, and C are within the crop. And so that was blueberries that were ripe at the time that we were trapping. And then we also set a trap at letter D, which again is that edge of the wooded field. And just because we had it, we went ahead and put an extra trap down at letter E. And so you can see that's the far edge of the wooded field. So there's only blueberries in this section that are labeled A, B, and C. What was interesting is that we did have peaches and blackberries south of letter E. So you don't see them in the image there, but they were, existing. And so what we found is just really low levels. I mean, 0 to 10% of our flies were actually feeding on anything. We're coming up positive for blueberries. And there was no difference in any of the sites. So, letter A, letter B, letter C, letter D, it was always 0 to 10% of our flies were feeding on blueberries. Even letter E, 0 to 10% of our flies were feeding on blueberries. So what that means is that the flies were probably moving quite frequently. We saw a lot of population mixing between the woods where they might have had, native blackberries or things like that that they were feeding on. Huckleberries, another kind of one of those hosts that you have up here in the Pacific Northwest. And so they were just moving really easily back and forth. So it was really interesting research. Unfortunately, it didn't really pan out in a way that I think would be helpful. We were hoping to find, that the flies that are feeding on the berries stay in the berries, because that would mean that we could be a lot more specific about pesticide use and things like that. But unfortunately, the flies really like to have like a little commute almost. So that's why I have this kind of Richard Scarry photos. Just the idea that we were pretty sure that in the morning, they're coming from the wooded edge, that protection from the woods, and they're moving back into the berry crop to infest again. So it's not as helpful as we were hoping. So the next thing that I did after I graduated is I went and did a short postdoc at the USDA ARS in Hawaii. And this was really fun research. So I was studying Drosophila fruit flies before, and Drosophila are, I don't know, it's kind of classic. Like those are really important here in the temperate region. That's the pest that's biggest here. But when you work with fruit flies, you always hear about these fruit flies called the true fruit flies or the tephritid fruit flies. And these are bigger. These are really kind of visible flies. They're maybe about a ½ inch long. They're really visible. And so these are really big pests in tropical areas. And so they have them all over the world, Southeast Asia, even up through the Mediterranean parts of Europe, and this is considered one of the most serious pests in the world. So there were 2 that we were specifically looking at in Hawaii. The oriental fruit fly was first found in Hawaii in the 1940s. So it is invasive to Hawaii. And it has been discovered in Florida in 2002 and in 2015. And so that's a really big deal because this is such a serious pest that they spent millions of dollars making sure that they eradicated it both times that it came through because this is really not a pest that we want in the continental United States. This pest attacks more than 400 fruits and vegetables, and these are all the things that we like to eat: apricots, cherries, citrus, figs, peaches, plums, tomatoes. One of the things that I found most shocking, it's like you hear about this pest, but it's different living there. And so just kind of living in Hawaii and working with growers and seeing just how bad this fly was. I mean, there'd literally be maggots in their tomatoes, like you can't grow produce in Hawaii because this pest is just at such high numbers and it's doing so much damage. This is a small part of why, produce is so expensive in Hawaii is because it's really hard to grow it locally when you have a pest this serious there. There's also this pest, which is considered somewhat of a lesser pest in Hawaii, and it's called the melon fly. And so this was introduced in the late 1800s, so it's been around for a long time in Hawaii. It's not found in the continental US. And so this one's a little more specific. It just lays its eggs in things like melon, squash, and other cucurbitaceae. Whether or not it was laying eggs in papaya since the late 1800s, it's a little dubious. It might have kind of grown over time, but it does also lay its eggs in papaya. So that's why it's a serious pest in Hawaii. So what's fantastic about this is that they have these really great pheromone lures. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with pheromone lures in your garden. This is something that we use pretty often in agriculture to try and attract a pest into a trap and kill it. And this specific, so I literally put that lure in probably 3 minutes before I before I took this photo. And what's amazing to me is how many flies have just appeared. And these are all male flies. So these lures are sex lures in this case, or they closely mimic a sex lure. And so it's attracting all these males to what they think is a female. So this is not a trap that would kill insects. We're actually trying to live trap them to use for our studies. But you get the idea. If you just put some liquid in the bottom, they would all come in and drown in that trap. So the research that I was working on in Hawaii is we were looking at an evaluation of insecticide resistance of these different fruit flies to an organic insecticide. And so this sounds really fancy, right? Like, it was really exciting. It's the first time I worked on insecticide resistance. But what it wound up being is this really kind of gross work. I made this funny face. I actually really had a great time. But what this wound up being is that trying to catch populations of fruit flies all over the Hawaiian Islands, you actually have to pull out really gross, rotting fruit from under trees and stuff, because this is where the larvae are actually found. And so you can see on this one down here, you see all these big fat yellow things. These are actually larvae crawling out of these mangoes. So these mangoes are really rotted. When we were collecting the samples. So this was what a lot of my work was, going around collecting rotting fruit, pulling out the flies, and then testing to see whether or not they had insecticide resistance. Okay, now we get to move into the really fun part of my job. So just after about 6 months of being in Hawaii, I shifted gears a little bit and I took a job as the research manager of agricultural sciences at Walt Disney World. And so it then shifted into talking about what I'm doing in my current role. Perfect, thank you. So now I want to get into kind of my goals for the job here. What is the vision of IPM extension programs for Southwest Washington State cranberries and shellfish, which are, the two crops that I work with here. So for cranberries, I've spent a lot of time speaking with growers in the last couple of months. I just got here in December, so I'm still pretty new, but it's clear that there's a couple pests that keep coming up. Cranberry weevil is one. And so this is not really a major pest for cranberry growers, at least in Long Beach Peninsula. The reason being, they are able to flood their fields. So the cranberry growers down here tend to have better water reserves. So typically folks have a reservoir of water on their field, and they're using this to harvest their crop. Everyone thinks about kind of, you put on the waders and you flood cranberries, but not all cranberries are grown that way or are harvested that way. Cranberries can also be hand harvested, where they have these machines that are essentially combs, and they run them through the vines and just pick up all the cranberries off of the combs, kind of a deal. You have to have a lot of water to do water harvesting. So up in Grayson, so just essentially just north of us, about an hour if you could fly, they are only doing this dry pick type harvest. And so because of that, because they don't have enough water, they do have more problems with cranberry weevil. What's nice about flooding your field is that if you pull all of the cranberries off within 24 hours, or they'll get damaged, but you're able to hold your water on your field. And so if you hold it for just about 48 hours, it's not so bad that it's going to kill the crop, but it is going to cause these weevils to drown. So typically flood harvesting, weevils are not an issue, but the growers that are up in Grayson that don't have that ability, they do see some weevil issues. And my concern there is that they only have one insecticide that they're really using for weevils. And so that to me means ding, 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 we might start to see insecticide resistance issues, right? Because one of the key things about insecticide resistance management is that we're using different modes of action and different products throughout a growing season. And so if there's only one product you can use, then it's likely that weevil will develop resistance. So that's one of the things that I really want to keep an eye on while I'm working here. The other pest, which is a lot more growers are talking about it, a lot more growers are interested in this, it's called cranberry tipworm. And so this is the image over on the far right. And so you'll notice there's not really a visible bug that you can see there. This is a really tiny insect. It's 2 millimeters in length. It's a gall midge. And so what it does is it lays its eggs right at the tip of that plant, and a little larvae will develop inside. And what happens is it kills the apical stem, or the apical growing part. And I know that as master gardeners, you know what happens if you pinch the top of a stem is it causes all of these offshoots to grow on the sides, right? It was something we used at Disney often just to get plants to be bushy. But here it's really a negative, because whereas before, if that stem were allowed to grow on its own, it would probably become a fruiting stem. So it develop buds and then berries and be able to produce, cranberries. But when you pinch the top and you grow these apical shoots, they tend to just be vegetative in the next couple seasons. And so the problem there is that you could see a potential yield loss reduction if, 70% of your fruiting buds had this pest come in and suddenly they're all vegetative. There's potential there that you would see yield loss. And so this is a pest that growers are really interested to finding more solutions for. I did wind up having a photo here, but you can see there's Long Beach and there's Grayson up in the north, and that's where they do that dry harvest. And if you've never been to Grayson, it's really interesting. It's this old lake bed. You can see in that picture over on the left-hand side, and it's just cranberries as far as the eye can see. And I'm going to shift into my next crop, which is shellfish. I have no shellfish experience whatsoever. As you saw from my history, I worked a lot with fruit crops, mainly because I really like to eat fruit. And so this was really kind of fun for me to get into, is trying to understand shellfish. And so shellfish, and you might know some of this already, but the shellfish that are grown here commercially are introduced species. So specifically what's grown most often down here is the Pacific shellfish. And these come from Japan originally. There's also Kumamotos, which I believe is the same species, just a different variety. And so the Kumamotos are also introduced from Japan. You'll see those kind of at more kind of specialty places in Seattle. And in fact, and then of course there's Atlantic oysters. Those are grown more commonly on the East Coast, but we do have some here. But the only shellfish here that's native is actually the Olympia oyster. And unfortunately, these photos are not really to scale. The Olympia oyster is maybe the size of a silver dollar, while the specific shellfish are the size you more typically think of as, a shooter. And a shooter oyster is really, that's actually a smaller oyster. These Pacific oysters can get quite large. I've seen them get like inches in length, up to 6, 7, 8 inches in length. So really, we're talking about two really different species. And so a lot of the shellfish growers that I work with are located either in Willapa Bay or up in Grays Harbor. And so one of the main shellfish pests is burrowing shrimp. And so what's really challenging about this pest is that it's actually native. So we're talking about a native pest that is affecting a introduced species. This is actually really common in fruit crops. What's interesting is that there's a lot of kind of local pushback of doing any kind of treatment for this native pest, whereas you wouldn't blink once about it in things like apples, where Ragelitis, or the apple maggot, is actually a native pest that learned how to feed on apples after we introduced them. But here in the estuary, it is more of a kind of an environmental consideration. It is a food source for green sturgeon and gray whales. And so that's part of the reason that it is kind of an ecological concern. It was managed with carbaryl, which is an insecticide. They briefly had a permit for imidacloprid, but currently there's no insecticides that you're allowed to use for burrowing shrimp in the two bays. So the problem with this pest is that it causes Pacific oysters to sink and suffocate in that sediment when you're using on bottom culture. And so essentially you remember that Pacific oyster is much bigger and it's heavier. And so once that ground gets completely mucked up by those burrowing shrimp, they go in and they like expel so much of the mud that it becomes super soft. You can see that guy is sinking into it. That's like essentially what this pest does. And so those oysters sink right through and they drown. So they are looking at some management solutions, things like using a mechanical dredge, which is also not super environmentally friendly. It has some real challenges, and it also can really mess up your tide flats if they're not the exact flat, perfect tide bed. So that can be really challenging to use. But there has also been some interesting work recently looking at using that native eelgrass, the eelgrass that our Samoanids love so much. If you're able to kind of use that to displace the burrowing shrimp, because you can have oysters growing in the same bed as native eelgrass. So potentially those two could coexist together and keep the burrowing shrimp out. So I put a little asterisk there. This is a really major pest if you're doing what's called bottom culture. And so this is, essentially where you take the oysters and you seed them directly into the tide flats. And so this is where the burrowing shrimp would be found. And it's the main method of culture, I would say, here in Willapa Bay, at least. The reason being is that you sell these oysters to a different market. I think about oysters, I think about the ones that you, like the shooter oysters, but there's a really large market, especially in Asia, for just like jarred oysters. And maybe you're more familiar with this than I am because you've been here longer. But this is really the product that you're selling bottom culture oysters to. It's an ugly oyster. It tends to be larger in size, and it's much cheaper to produce. So it requires like less labor. And so this is the type that you're doing, like a shucked oyster product. Now, you can avoid burrowing shrimp if you do something like off bottom culture or bag culture. And so here's just some images here that you can see from France where they do this type of culture. And so this is really to create those kind of shooter type oysters. You get more individual oysters of a smaller size by doing this. It does require a lot of labor. It also involves a lot of plastic. One of the other things that I want to point out is that, I don't know about you, but every time I drive up 101 to South Bend, I'm just like in awe of how unbelievably beautiful Willapa Bay is. And if we turned entirely to this culture method, it would no longer be a beautiful bay. And so that's one of the kind of considerations is like when we're thinking about management, it sounds horrible, but like, does aesthetics play into that? Do we care about what our bay looks like? So interested in kind of finding methods to manage this pest. There has been something really interesting called the cliff. I wish I had a better photo of it that I included here. Oh, I do have a photo of it here. So for whatever reason, in the past few years, they have found that there is this line. So you can see in the top part of this photo here, this is all burrowing shrimp with all of those little holes. That's where you're just literally going to sink into the mud. And then you can see on the lower half that you just don't see those holes. So essentially the burrowing shrimp have been dying off along this interesting line. There's one up in Tokeland, and there's also one here in Nakata near Paul's Slough. And they've been shifting over time, but no one knows much more than that they've been shifting. They're not sure what it is exactly that's killing the burrowing shrimp. But there could be something interesting here for kind of management to look at for management practices. And then the other pest that we have here is, of course, the European green crab. And so this pest is invasive. You probably heard about it. Hopefully you've heard about it in the news. We did just have an outreach event on Saturday showing it off if you came by the Razor Clam Festival. But what's key here is they have these 5-toothed teeth on the shell, and this makes them different from native crabs. These guys are shore crabs. They're displacing our native shore crabs. They're digging up eel beds. They're probably eating oysters when they're at a small stage. They're definitely eating clams when they're at a small stage. And so this is really a pest that we're concerned about, not only for shellfish growers, but also for our local ecology. I'm going to skip talking about this, except just to say that we see a lot more of these on the coast than we do in Puget Sound. And yeah, with that, I'll wrap up. I had a lot of folks who helped me with the research, and I will take any questions.
What a career already, Laura, right? When you think about where you started from, right, and where you're at here today. So I'm curious about, what do you think you're bringing to cranberries and to shellfish from your past research and your past experience? What new approaches, considerations, or perspectives do you think you're bringing in?
I'm really glad you're asking me this question now and not in December. It would have been hard to say in December. I came in and I think I was feeling kind of self-conscious because it does feel like I've never worked in cranberries and I've never worked in shellfish. But one of the things that I appreciate now is that I have worked in a lot of different systems with some really difficult to manage pests. And, you might not have perspective, but really get distracted easily. I like working on different products, different types of programs. I didn't present this research here, but I've worked with GM insects, or work with genetically modified insects. I've worked with sterile insects. So I've done all of these really different things within IPM, within management. And so I understand what you need to do to get a management program off the ground. I know it works. I know it doesn't work. And I know how to really be serious about invasive pests like European green crab. Because when I speak with some of the ecologists here, it's clear that they really want to understand, things like the population dynamics and things like that. But to me, it's kind of like, but how do we manage it? How do we get our estuary back from this pest? And I think that I'm really prepared to answer that question.
Questions or comments for Laura? Both of these industries, obviously, as you can appreciate, are hugely important to our two counties' economies. I mean, there are hundreds of individuals that are employed by these by both of these industries, and so that it is indeed critical that these IPM solutions, which I find, by the way, fascinating, that you seem to have a strong emphasis on biological and or cultural types of programs, right? For these in terms of treatments here, and that, of course, that's a big difference, right, from the past treatments. I mean, that both the cranberry growers and their fertilization, their chemigation, right, in which they introduce chemical fertilizers into their irrigation methods, and of course the use of carbaryl and imidacloprid on the shellfish growers, right? They've been using that since the 50s. So you're probably almost radical in your thought processes here relative to biocontrols or cultural methods.
You're absolutely right, Kelly. And these are things I would really love to explore here. I say that with a big caveat. It's really easy and fun to do this research in a lab, and it's a different thing to see it working, here. See it working and still being able to employ everyone that you're employing on the farm. And so one of the challenges is it's really nice to see these cultural methods work, but sometimes when you bring them out to the field, they don't work quite the same. That pest that I studied for my PhD, Drosophila suzuki, there's some improvement you can get when you do things like pruning, but you're still going to have to spray a pesticide. Unfortunately, it's just a pest that we have thrown the kitchen sink at, and we can't find a solution to it, and so it's not, I really wish that we could walk away, but I think that pesticides still have a place in an IPM program. Yeah.
And that's an important message for all of us, right? Is that we are not anti-chemical, right? And it as a program. But holy cow, your whole research, history, has been all focused in terms of finding interesting alternatives.
Yeah.
Say, as one of the museum employees there, I just want to say how happy we are to have you there. It's been really nice, us 4 women who work in the museum, to say we've got a woman researcher out in the building in front of us. So we just welcome you, and we're really glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Ava. I'm really excited to bring that perspective too, because it's really, I come from berry crops in the southeastern US, and I can't tell you how many times I would give a talk to growers, and it's, over 90% of my growers were male. And the wives didn't really have a lot to do with the growing. And what's fantastic about coming here is that both cranberry growers and shellfish growers, I have a lot of female growers, and it's really exciting to think about, how can we best serve both of these groups?
Great.
Holly has a question in the chat about how would a blueberry look, right, if a spotted wing Drosophila had laid an egg in it?
Oh, there's this classic set of images. I wish I had pulled it up. So the blueberries are a little more firm. They hold up a little bit better. If you were asking me, Laura, how do I know when I put it in my mouth whether or not there's a maggot in it? I'm sorry to tell you that there is definitely a maggot in it. The problem is that, the riper the fruit is, the less time that maggot has been in it, the more it looks kind of firm and solid, and you can pop it in your mouth. And let me tell you, you're not going to taste it. It's not going to hurt you. But the problem is that it decreases the shelf life of that berry. So oftentimes berries are not just eaten as soon as they're off the bush. A lot of times they're shipped around and things like that. So once you start hitting the 7-day, 14-day, even 30-day window, that berry is really going to kind of disintegrate. It's really not going to have the same shelf life it did before. And so it's going to be a real problem for commercial berry production. But I promise you, I've eaten so many Drosophila in my life knowingly, I mean, sometimes I know that it's in there and I eat it anyway and it still tastes good.
You know what? Go ahead, please.
Oh, I have a question back to your current work with the shellfish, et cetera. And I'm wondering what kind of support system you have, and who are you working with, other agencies or community organizations, and what kind of research are you doing, if any?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kathy. Really broad question. But so what's fantastic about shellfish is that there's a lot of different players who are already in the system and helping. So my office here, I'll tell you, I currently don't have anyone employed. I am looking to hire someone. If you're interested, Kelly, I will follow up and send you that job ad. I can't believe I'm just now thinking of this, but I'm looking for someone part-time to help me this summer if anyone's interested. So I'm working on building a lab right now. And so hopefully I'll have kind of support in that sense to build my research program, because it's really challenging to do all of this alone. But speaking about collaborators, there's a lot of folks, including Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, DNR, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Ecology, Sea Grant, University of Washington Sea Grant, which is kind of like extension, but for like shellfish, have also been really, really wonderful collaborators. There's these private entities that the shellfish growers pay to do research that like specifically helps them. So I don't know quite what it stands for, but the PCGSA and PSI are both parts of that Pacific Shellfish Institute. That's the PSI. So it's, it's interesting. There's so many different players, but everyone has like a different role to play. And so a lot of this job has been learning, where do I fit in this giant schematic, and how can I help in a way that isn't, we keep talking about like there's so many people in it, but there's so much research that could be done. So how can we all work together to make sure that we're solving different parts of this problem instead of stepping on each other's toes?
Follow up to that, Laura, do you find that your other colleagues across WSU Extension might, are clueless when they start talking about, okay, you're over here in shellfish, you're over here in cranberries, and it's a far cry from east side apples and pears and cherries?
It's very different. And I would say also that there's a lot of permitting involved in shellfish research, which has never been involved. There's a little bit of permitting in cranberries, but it's nothing like shellfish. So I didn't appreciate just how much government regulation has to happen. I mean, just, you're asking what research am I doing this summer? Answer is I got to get my permits first, apparently. There's 4 different permits I have to get just to do research this summer. So it's really kind of understanding that it's just a different beast. And yeah, I don't think that they fully understand it in Pullman, although they have been really supportive. And what's nice is that I have also been leaning on, I come from an entomology background. And so I think about, okay, pheromone traps, how could we potentially find a pheromone trap or something like that for European green crab? I don't have the skills to do pheromones. That's very like chemical based work, but I just met someone who I think might be helpful here in the state. She works with apples, but she was like, I'm totally open to it. If you help me get the equipment, we could do aquatics. So it's kind of nice having those connections also through Pullman.
On that note, I want to reach out to Terry, and Terry, you want to share, your favorite green crab trap that you found on your beach?
Yes, I had Fish and Wildlife and DNR come out, a team from both those groups who came out and set green crab traps around a dead whale that's close to our beach, about a quarter mile west of our beach, and it's been there since Martin Luther King Day, actually, is when my son and grandson and I discovered it. And so anyway, they were able to they set traps around the whale and set up cameras, actually, also underwater cameras, because it was in the middle of the tide flats. And were able to trap overnight one female green crab that was just full of a huge sack of eggs. So that's my green crab story.
That's really interesting because right now we're really trying to get a better understanding of like what is green crab doing, where is it at different times of day and even during a season. And kind of the holy grail of this is that pregnant or that gravid female crab. And so it's really interesting that you were able to find one, because we can really count on one hand, most of our growers, how many times they've found a gravid female, so that's like a really meaningful data point. That's really interesting.
Well, they were extremely excited because it was they only got one, and it did happen to be this female with eggs.
Yeah, that is exciting. I've written down what you said because I'd love to reach out to them and hear more about it. Thank you.
Laura, this is probably going to inspire you to take more dead fish or dead mammals and place them into the tide flats, right? And bait them this way.
Yeah. I think that's one of the key questions though, is like what bait was, going to attract. And so it is something I'm trying to think, how much can I share? It's something we're interested in looking at, and we might be looking at this year. So we're definitely interested in bait type and what green crabs are eating in the estuary.
They actually set out cages that had other, I don't remember what kind of fish they used, but they used another something to bait, and they also took off parts of the blubber to use in some of the traps as well. So hopefully they could tell you a little more about that. I was there, but I don't remember what they actually put in these other traps surrounding the whale.
Yeah, I'll definitely reach out. I know mackerel is the fish that they use for the sea grant trapping here. So that's kind of the standard, because I guess it's an oily, smelly fish. But it's interesting. And, again, coming back to that idea of like a gravid female, one of the things that is true for insects, I showed you the pheromone lures, but we do often see that different sexes are attracted to different things. And so it's possible, that we might find some food type that's more attractive to females, and then we would definitely want to use that in our management program. So these could be really important pieces of data.
Other questions, comments for Laura?
I have a question, or actually a sort of a statement. You talked about spraying pesticides for ghost shrimp. Well, that caused a war between the oyster growers and the salmon and sports fishermen. And smolts, as they come down, Chinook, coho, and steelhead, acclimate themselves in the estuaries there until they feed on the ghost shrimp and other isopods, and before they head out to the open ocean as they get a certain size. So you got to watch what you're doing. You're going to wipe out our salmon, which we're having problems like on the Chehalis River. All the spring Chinook are basically gone in the Chehalis River from multiple factors.
Yeah. And I do just want to recognize, I know that there's a lot of interest in protecting all of the species that use the estuary, right? That comes on both sides, because, there's a great appreciation that everyone here has for the species that you have in the estuaries. And the problem with the salmon, I know, is a lot more complex. I know that it's not just pesticide based. There have been some studies about some runoff from tires and asphalt and other things like that, which are strongly affecting salmon. That's being done at the Puyallup Research Station. Not something that I want to speak to too much, only because I haven't looked into that. But I know the researchers working on that. But certainly these are all species that we want to protect, right? And so it's an idea of how do we balance the economic input and the economic driver that we have in our county with things like sports recreation, right? And with things like protecting these native species, because I think it's mostly just about striking a balance between all of these different really important parts.
Thanks.
Laura, a quick follow-up back. You mentioned that you were actually looking at using the native eelgrass, right? Marina, Zostera marina. But I'm curious that you don't think japonica would work, the invasive japonica would work the same way? Or is it...
That is a great question. I did not say that I would be interested in looking at that. Someone named Jennifer Rusnick has done a lot of research looking at that. I know that the marina they're located in slightly different places. And so
Right.
I think that's part of the challenge is that, and they also have a very different like root structure that I think would be really important there. So I don't want to give an answer either way, but I could see some key differences that might cause them to act differently.
Other questions, comments for Laura? We'll definitely want to have you back to talk more about the research and more about, as things progress in here. And of course, don't forget your berry work here too, right? Because there's a lot of blueberries and raspberries, of course, that folks are very interested in growing here as well. So you're obviously going to be you have so much experience in that regard. Questions, comments? Laura, I want to thank you so very much, right, for making time available and of course making the transition, a huge transition, right? So no longer we'd be running around in polo shirts and shorts, right? At least not for the next few months here.
I know, but I'm back to temperate crops, and I'm so thrilled to be back with temperate crops again. I do love them. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Very good. Any other comments for the good of the order here, folks? Because I want to make sure that folks are reminded that tonight, of course, is our board meeting beginning at 6 p.m. The URL is here. All are invited. We've got a lot on the menu to talk about tonight. So prepare yourselves for a fun time, and we'll see you all here at 6 p.m. Anything further for the good of the order? Otherwise, we'll call it a day. And thank you all for participating. Okay. Stay safe, everyone. We'll see you.